Good afternoon. My name is Richard Hecht, and I'm the Academic Program Director of the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Symposium in Jewish Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And this is our final presentation for the year. We've had 10 presentations this year. Some of you may remember that we began with Professor Michael Hoberman talking about Allegra Goodman and Philip Roth, and we visited the high Andes. We found out about Henry Kissinger and his policy in the Middle East, and we also learned a little bit about Bambi and the real original context of Bambi. We visited the Jews of Chile, and we also learned a bit about Italian Jewish history and cuisine. So today, I'm very, very pleased that Tom Freudenheim has agreed to talk to us about his experiences in a life in Jewish art. And Tom Freudenheim is truly distinguished. He, of course, as I noted in the poster, took his undergraduate degree at Harvard College, and then went on to the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. And he became the Assistant Secretary for Museums at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., which gave him responsibility for the national museums. He's also been the director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Worcestershire Art Museum, London's Gilbert Collection, as well as the deputy director and chief operating officer of the Jewish Museum in Berlin. His other positions include the director of the museum program at the National Endowment for the Arts, assistant director of the University Art Museum in Berkeley, the director of the Foundation Arnaldi Pomodoro in Milan, the curator of the Jewish Museum in New York, the director of the Evo Institute for Jewish Research, also in New York, and he has been a guest scholar at many institutions, including the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and he has also been and is at the present time a fellow of the Goodenough College in London. He's sat on many boards, including the American Federation of Arts, where he was a past president and chair, the Center for Book Arts. He is also a past board president of the Yellow Barn Music School and Festival at Putney, Vermont, and he has also been a member of the Foundation for Jewish Culture in New York and has served on many other boards and advisory committees. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, Tom, to our Taubman Symposium. And we will shift to your presentation as soon as you tell me.
Okay, I'm going to start talking, and just so everybody understands, the aged people don't know how to use how to talk and chew gum at the same time. I wanted very much to use visuals because of the nature of what I'm talking about. So hopefully the visuals will all work for you. This probably is the first time I've ever been invited to talk just about myself. Thanks to Professor Hecht. That turns out to be a significantly bigger challenge than I had imagined. Actually, I'm not really sure what Jewish art is, so I've decided to rename my talk My Life in Jewish and in Art. But even that's turned out to be more difficult than I anticipated. Maybe this is an experiment in the autobiography or memoir that my family and friends keep telling me that I ought to write, but which I've resisted so far in doing. A more accurate concept for this might be hybrid identities, which is a term I happened on earlier this week in Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, describing several strange but interesting artists. Rather than starting with my beginnings, I'm going to fast forward to a more recent activity. Richard, first slide, please. Now and again, I enjoy doing what I like to call a Jewish tour of an art museum. I've played this at Washington's National Gallery and the Art Institute of Chicago, but more often at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The proposition is that if you're Jewish, or at least if you're Jewish the way I am, you see your way through the museum with a different set of filters. At the Met, I always start at the foot of the grand staircase. Next slide, please, where the names of the founders and the earliest donors are carved in stone. Next slide, please. Note that you no way you can really read these on your computers, but the first plaque, which was dedicated in 1870, has no Jewish names. The next one has several Jewish names. Amelia Lazarus, who was a benefactress, her estate left the largest amount of money to the Met, and then lots of things to Jewish charities. Benjamin Altman of the famous B. Altman store, Joseph Pulitzer, who was still considered Jewish in those days, and Jacques Seligman, an art dealer in Paris. Those go on the second plaque. By the next slide, please. By the 1920s, the plaques include more Jews. Here we get Jacob Schiff, George Blumenthal, Michael Friedsam, and Florence Blumenthal. And we also start seeing the emergence of quote unquote new money, like the Rockefellers. They start appearing on the plaques after that. But by the time you reach the next slide, please, the most recent, which is actually the unfinished plaque, you can see it still has room for more names on it. There are about a third of the names are Jewish. So it's changed a bit. But let's remember that many of our most beloved public institutions were founded by public-spirited men of wealth, I emphasize men, of wealth, intent on contributing to their communities, while also sometimes legitimizing the source of their fortunes. This is a complicated issue well beyond the scope of this talk, but perhaps the best example is Andrew Carnegie, the ruthless steel magnate responsible for the deaths of strikers, albeit assisted by his henchman, Henry Clay Frick, he of the wondrous Frick collection, which I hope some of the people listening have visited. Several important Carnegie foundations still exist, but perhaps Carnegie's most important philanthropic legacy is in the Carnegie libraries. All over the world, actually, over 1,600 of them across our country, which played a central role in the Americanization of several generations of immigrants. So it's too easy to dismiss the anti-Semitism, or we want to call it, be kind and call it clubbiness, of a power elite without recognizing their significant contributions to the cultural life of America. As we say these days, it's complicated. But back to my tour at the foot of the Met's grand staircase. Next slide, please. Because a few steps from those plaques, we will find Roman and early Byzantine Jewish objects, including this fragment of a glass bowl with a menorah, a shofar, and a Torah ark. It's actually one of the first things you would see if you were carefully looking as you walk into the galleries of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, along with other Jewish objects. Next slide, please. Nearby, there are the great David plates from the so-called Cyprus treasure. They're 17th century Byzantine, definitely not Jewish, but of course, Jewish themes, scenes from the life of David. And as one moves into their next slide, please. So you can see David and Goliath here. It's one of the, for my money, one of the glories of the entire Metropolitan Museum of Art. Not a painting, it's a silver plate. There, of course, if you keep going then into the medieval, go down that corridor into the, next slide, please, into the medieval galleries, you can see figures of, next slide, please, Moses and Aaron, 12th century Gothic figures, probably from a church, but Moses and Aaron nonetheless. And then nearby, interestingly, next slide, please, a German-Austrian Siddur, a prayer book, which is also known, I think it's a previous one, Richard, Or have we, no, sorry, we're out of our, that's fine. So they mix up a lot of wonderful really Jewish things like a Siddur, along with things from churches, which are like Moses and Aaron. And so you get this interplay between, when you're sort of, as I say, looking with Jewish eyes, between things that are actually Jewish for Jewish use and things that are not. You'll get things that look Jewish or look potentially Jewish, like these church objects, which look like miniature Torah arks, but of course are for the Catholic Mass, containers for the host. And next, please, next slide, please. And then lots of chalices, which are used in churches as well, which of course some of us call Kiddush cups. Interestingly, in this section, some of the object labels also include previous owners' names. Next slide. So, for example, you'll get an object that was actually donated to the Met by J.P. Morgan, who bought it from a Jewish dealer, who bought it from a Jewish owner. So this Jewish eye can wander in interesting ways. And I don't know whether the Jews know their Bible any better than evangelical Christians, but they're endless, obviously, to you here, endless Christian religious paintings that depict stories in the Hebrew Bible. I always like pointing out what I think of as anomalies as well. Next slide, please. For example, here's the flight into Egypt, from the Holy Family's escape from King Herod's assassins, as described in the book of Matthew. I'm showing you a modernish one by Henry Osawa Tanner. But it's interesting to me that the flight into Egypt is a really major Christian theme, whereas, of course, Jews commemorate the flight, the exodus from Egypt. And I like the irony, the kind of imbalance of that, although the exodus from Egypt is also depicted in art, but not as often as the Christian flight into Egypt, Jesus and Mary and Joseph escaping into Egypt. And then, of course, there are crucifixion scenes, which I'm not showing you here, not yet, which have lots of anti-Semitic caricatures in them as well. So we don't have time for that. In the tour of the Met that I'm giving you here, you got to come to New York for it. I'm not all that interested in works by artists who are Jewish, like Marc Chagall or even Mark Rothko or Philip Guston, for example. But they're certainly part of the mix, and they usually are part of my tour of the Met. Rather, it's more interesting for me to visit, next please, the 18th century Italian decorative arts galleries and discover gorgeous Venetian Torah crown and pair of Rimonim that were acquired only a few years ago and that are now shown along with other Venetian not religious art, but from the same period. 18th century Venetian art includes Jewish stuff and other stuff. Or we might visit the Lehman Wing at the back of the museum with its attempt to recreate, next slide, please, Philip and Robert Lehman's great 54th Street mansion, which I remember visiting when the Lehman collection still lived there. And that includes, the Lehman collection includes my very favorite work in that collection is Giovanni di Paolo's next slide, please, 1445 Creation of the World and Expulsion from Paradise. Both very Christian themes and also in some ways very Jewish themes. I've actually used this image as for Rosh Hashanah New Year's card a couple of times. Since some New Yorkers will have seen the Lehman trilogy on stage, maybe not just New Yorkers, this Lehman Wing kind of enlarges on the context for that story and the related patronage. Next slide, please. It's no secret that the old money Jews who managed to get on museums' boards, like Robert Lehman at the Met and Lee Block at the Art Institute of Chicago, they did their best to keep off newer moneyed, often Eastern European Jews from those same boards. And this is to remind you that, that all of these institutions are repositories of historical and sociological information, along with all that stuff that we go there to look at. Another version of this, next please, Here's Robert and Philip. And next, please. Another version of this is one of my favorite museum anecdotes. I'll explain further on. I worked at New York's Jewish Museum in the 1960s. For those of you who haven't been there, it's housed in the neo-Gothic mansion shown here that was built by the Jewish banker Felix Warburg, whose widow gave it to the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1944. It opened as a museum, as a Jewish museum in 1947, and it's still going strong. So now and again, when people knew that I had worked at the Jewish Museum, someone would ask me, so what's it like to work in a Frank Lloyd Wright building? Meaning, of course, the Guggenheim Museum, 4 blocks down from the Warburg Mansion, suggesting the name Guggenheim somehow means Jewish. And I've never been clear whether this is sort of subliminal anti-Semitism or just ignorance, but I can never forget. It hasn't happened recently, I have to say, so maybe things have changed. Okay, let me backpedal a bit on how I got here or how I got there. Unlike Judy Garland or Esther Blodgett in A Star is Born, I wasn't born in a trunk. I was born in the Hoppenlau Clinic in Stuttgart, Germany, in July 1937. That's certified by my birth certificate with a swastika stamped on it. Although my father was from Berlin and my mother from a city in Upper Silesia, my parents had moved to Stuttgart after they married in 1932. Long before the political debates about abortion, my mother told me that when her pregnancy was visible, people stopped her on the street and told her she should be having an abortion because it was a sin to bring a Jewish child into the world at such a time. That, along with my conventional left liberal leaning politics, have certainly colored my feelings about the years-long discussions about abortion. But I digress. I'm going to be digressing now and again. Having recently belatedly devoted myself to a serious study of the massive archive of family papers that I have, I'm still in the process of trying to decipher the Jewish or Jewy parts of my background. My grandfather, Leopold, was born in 1852 in a small town in East Prussia. He described his parents, next slide please, as very observant and said that his mother always wore a sheitel. That there's several pictures of her, and it's quite clear that she's wearing a sheitel. On the other hand, in his considerable writing about growing up and his background, etc., he never mentions Hebrew lessons or a bar mitzvah, which presumably he had, but he goes to some length to describe his Greek and Latin lessons, and later, as an adult, his French and English lessons, which he took in order to function in the commercial world. He moved to Berlin at age 17, joining his older brothers who had come before him. And while he was proud of his seat in the grand, maybe we should call it grandiose, Neue Synagogue, next slide, please, on Oranienburger Strasse, which some of you may have visited. It was dedicated in 1866. It's not clear that my grandfather spent a lot of time there. He and my grandmother were married in Oranienburger Strasse, and he does name the officiating rabbi as well as the ones who officiated his parents' funerals. But unlike the caricatures you may have of so-called assimilated German Jews, my father's family seems to have been very much like semi-involved, liberal, and sporadically observant Jews with which you're likely familiar, or perhaps some of you who are on this Zoom are yourselves. Ditto my mother's family, although she told me of how her father felt obliged to resign as head of the local B'nai B'rith in 1920 when one of his daughters married a non-Jew. Intermarriage has a long history in our family. Contrary to what I was told about such mixed unions when I was growing up in the 1940s, my Tante Keta and Uncle Fritz seem to have had a very good and long, although childless marriage, surviving the war in Eastern Germany. Perhaps because my uncle wasn't Jewish, but it was certainly not an argument against intermarriage. Although his parents were shopkeepers in a small town in East Prussia, after my grandfather followed his older brothers to Berlin, he made a significant fortune in the lumber and veneer business. By the time my father was born in 1904, my grandparents were living, next slide, please, on one of the Berlin's poshest streets, on the third floor of a house whose other residents included the Kaiser's personal physician, one of Germany's great military heroes, General von Moltke, as well as the Jewish artist Hermann Struck. Next, please. Struck was an early Zionist and a close personal friend of Theodor Herzl. Next, please. And the man who was also the man who taught printmaking to Marc Chagall when Chagall was in Berlin for his first exhibition there in 1913-14. Struck also officially represented the interests of Polish Jews at the Versailles Peace Conference. While he made Aliyah in 1922, next slide, please, his house on Haifa's Hadar HaKarmel, designed by German architect Alexander Berwald, is now a museum, which some of you may have visited if you've been to Haifa. Struck seems to have kept his Berlin apartment for some years after making Aliyah. Since he was visiting Berlin in August 1926, next slide, please, when he drew a death mask of my grandfather on his deathbed. Struck was clearly very influential in encouraging both my father's Zionism and my father's art interests. So there's a kind of art and Zionist leitmotif, not necessarily in that order, that underpinned my father's background and in turn managed to seep into mine. During my father's brief first marriage, 1927 to 1929, he was an art dealer in Berlin, specializing in Judaica. Next slide, please. Bits of correspondence from that time indicate that he also occasionally handled non-Jewish material. And while there were none of his old Judaica objects in our home, there was a significant collection of 17th and 18th century French and Netherlandish engravings, which I've given, the best of which I've given to those museums. Next slide, please. My father's chief client for Judaica seems to have been his rich brother-in-law, who was a banker from Hanover. My uncle's significant collection went from Germany with him to San Francisco. Next slide, please, where it was displayed in his home. On Lion Street in San Francisco, as well as in Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco and at the 1939 Golden Gate International Exhibition on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. My uncle's collection was sold, next please. My uncle's collection, next slide. Next slide, please. My uncle's collection was sold in 1950 at Park Burnett, which is now Sotheby's, and it was actually the first major post-war Judaica sale, and sort of a historic moment because it was when the beginning of Judaica coming on the market in New York. Many of those pieces are now traceable to the collections of the Jewish Museum in New York, the Israel Museum, the Skirball Museum in Los Angeles, etc. I've given a complete photo archive of my father's Judaica inventory to the Magnus Museum at UC Berkeley, since it's now the only American museum with a serious Jewish interest in Jewish ceremonial art. But back to my dad, this was apparently no way for a 25-year-old to make a living. So he gave that up after his divorce, not from my mother, from his first wife. He seems to have attempted to interest major German museums in Judaica, since I have responses to his letters, which I don't have his letters, but I have the responses from the great museums of Munich, Dresden, and Berlin, telling him that they're not really interested in collecting Judaica. Go fly a kite. He was an accomplished pianist, my father, and played the piano every day. And then he tried to make his living as a composer. I still have his scores, and they sound pretty much like standard Berlin cabaret music. But that didn't go anywhere either. And then he played the piano every day, actually, until he died, even in old age homes when he was an old man, composing romantic songs of various kinds. But his only published work is the one you see here, Stand Up and Be Counted, which is a 1945 Zionist anthem, which was sung at many Zionist meetings across America in its day in the 1945 to 1948 years when Zionism was front and center. The creation of the state in Israel of Israel was front and center. Not making it in the world of music, my father apparently then devoted himself almost entirely to Zionism. He said that he learned his Zionism from Hermann Struck, certainly not from his parents, who I don't think had any interest in it. And correspondence between the Strucks in Haifa and my father in Germany and then the USA seemed to confirm that. My dad's Stuttgart papers show him as a member of the board of the Jewish community, extraordinary for a man in his late 20s and early 30s. He's also deep into Jewish sports clubs such as the Maccabi and Hakoach, which I always thought was very funny since my dad was about as unathletic as you could get, as well as in his involvement in Zionist organizations, and he even served as a representative to the World Zionist Congress. My mother, next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm just looking. Okay. My mother was formidable. She was also a big Zionist, was a member of WITZO in Germany, but she wasn't a zealot like my father. She was always bad-mouthing the National Council of Jewish Women as distinct from Hadassah. About 25 years ago, I was giving a talk to the National Council of Jewish Women, and I mentioned to them that I always thought it was a not very good Jewish organization. Later on, they looked at me strangely. I told my mother about it because I thought she'd be proud of my dissing them, and she said, how could you do that? And I said, well, you always told me they were no good. She said, of course, the National Council of Jewish Women is terrific. It's just that I was always competitive, and I wanted to make sure we had more members in Hadassah than they had. So that was my misunderstanding of my mother. There are two German words I don't remember ever hearing. One is Heimat, homeland, and the other is exile. Indeed, my father often reminded us that he did not want us to learn the language of murderers, even while using German words in the middle of completely English conversation. Still, when I was a kid, I sometimes wondered whether he might be disappointed in us for not readily quoting Goethe and Heine. My mother once corrected me when I said we were refugees. She insisted we were immigrants. Many confused messages in a household that consisted of lots of furniture and other items brought along from Germany, even though we couldn't buy anything from post-war Germany. Well, at least not until my father bought a huge Mercedes in his old age, but that was not until around 1982. In retrospect, growing up Jewish was very complicated for me, even if I didn't really sense it at the time. My parents had settled in Buffalo, the reasons for which I won't bore you. Buffalo was still a major industrial city in those days when I was growing up. It was into the 1950s, actually, and a great place to grow up with a small but active Jewish community, of which my parents, only in their 40s at the time, somehow very quickly became leaders in the Zionist parts of that community. By 1944, my mother and father, who had only arrived in the States 6 years earlier, were already the local leaders of Hadassah and the ZOA. Not today's ZOA, I assure you, Zionist Organization of America. It was different in the 40s. And my father was a member of the National Zionist Executive. Guests at our home were notables like Golda Meir when she was still Meyerson, and Moshe Sharet when he was still Shertok, as well as notable American Zionist leaders such as Abihail Silver and Stephen Wise. Some people might classify Jews as more observant or less observant, but in our family, you were either a Zionist or a self-hating Jew. At least that's how I sensed it. I'm not sure whether our Reform Temple's Sunday school even offered Hebrew, since in those days only about half the boys celebrated a bar mitzvah, and bat mitzvah hadn't even made it to the conservative synagogues yet. I, on the other hand, was subjected to private Hebrew lessons at home once a week, not to teach me Torah or rabbinic literature, but to make sure I would speak modern Hebrew. It's all a bit confusing when examined carefully and from this distance in time. Was I being prepared to make Aliyah at 10 years old, which was when the UN's partition of Palestine took place? I was the exemplary little boy who could be trotted out as the paradigm of what the next generation of Jews would look like. At my confirmation in our reform, kind of Protestantish temple, I gave my speech in Hebrew to an audience that surely didn't understand a word of it. But it was a way of articulating an up yours to the community that wasn't as Zionist as my parents were. In those days, the post-war 1940s, it was important for Zionists to trot out prominent non-Jews who would speak on behalf of the cause. The idea being, well, if the Goyim think a Jewish state is a good idea, it must be a good idea. Most of these people were former war correspondents who had witnessed the war's devastation in Europe and were very concerned about the fate of thousands of refugees and camp survivors they had seen. Among them was Dorothy Thompson. You can see her here with her second husband, Sinclair Lewis, and their son. She was the first journalist to interview Hitler in 1931 and was also the first American journalist expelled from Nazi Germany in 1934. Thompson was guest speaker at a citywide Buffalo Zionist rally, next slide please, on December 2nd, 1945. I still get the shivers when I remember my 8-year-old self being trotted out in front of an audience of thousands to light the Hanukkah candles, as was reported in the following day's Buffalo papers. Always the cute little boy, ever the tool of his parents' Zionism. Shortly thereafter, Thompson started to be concerned about the rights of Palestinians, something that's only come to me late in life. One of the first journalists to go public in this way. So she quickly made it onto my parents' shit list, which included people such as Rabbi Elmer Berger, head of the anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism, and the philanthropist and major art collector, Lessing Rosenwald, one of its primary founders. Ironically, my father's first cousin was the principal investment advisor to Lessing Rosenwald's brother, Bill Rosenwald, who was a major supporter of Zionist causes. And I always wondered whether their respective Rosenwald funding strategies canceled each other out, one being pro and one anti-Zionist. And then there were the guns. In this day of endless gun discussions, it's interesting to think back on when our home was a secret depository for guns. Jewish, and I guess other GIs who apparently could keep their wartime guns were asked to contribute them for Israel's fighting forces. Our house was the regional depot, and I would be asked to ride shotgun as my father drove all night from Buffalo to the New York docks to make sure he wouldn't fall asleep. This was 1948. My father was 44 then, when I was 11 years old. And I spent a summer at a Hebrew speaking camp in the Catskills, the first of several summers. But this summer it was sponsored, there's one sponsored by Hechalutz Hatzair, a leftist Zionist group, very different from my parents' so-called general Zionist interests. We did not sing Hatikva at morning flag raising. We sang Techazakna, the Jewish workers' song, based on a poem by the great Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik. Let your spirits not fail. Come joyously, shoulder to the people's aid. The camp counselors were all about to go fight in the War of Independence. Next slide, please. And so the entire camp was kind of geared toward what was going on in Israel at that time. I still have my letters home written on paper with Henrietta Zold's picture in the corner, presumably from my mother's Hadassah life. And I described their fighting the Arabs. Shortly before my mother died in the late 1990s, I found the letters and I told her I couldn't believe that she would send me to a camp like this to hate Arabs. She said, I don't hate Arabs. She had no idea what I was talking about. And then I showed her these letters. But it really clearly colored my childhood in one way or another. Okay, maybe you're wondering where in all this Jewish and Zionist life there was any art. On the walls, of course. For one thing, there were significant numbers of etchings by Hermann Struck, an entire wall of, next slide please, of bearded observant Jews wearing tefillin, saying Kiddush or Havdalah, or just being portrayed. This particular one is the largest of all the ones that was on our wall. It was a wall that was sort of like an altar because we had Kiddush on the sideboard in front of it. And I now realize it was kind of like an iconostasis in an Eastern Orthodox church. that has all of these images that are kind of holy. But these portraits of observant Jews didn't look anything like my own ancestral portraits. I now realize they were just old Jews. I never gave any thought that they didn't, that my grandparents and even grandparents didn't look anything like that. On other walls, there were Struck views of Venice and scenes of Palestine that he did lots of. And then there was also a large Calvary scene with 3 crosses that was in our living room. But there was none of the old Judaica that my father had handled as a dealer. In some ways, it was as if my father had put that part of his life in a drawer, literally, maybe because it was during his first marriage. Since it was in a drawer that I first discovered the archive from his failed late 1920s business and failed marriage venture. I'm still trying to decipher whether my parents were trying to prepare me to be or do something specific. I know that all I ever wanted for my own sons was for them to find themselves, to develop their own paths and careers, and not move in some direction that was determined by my own fantasies. And that's what's happened to them, although admittedly, each of them is involved in work that reflects my own interests. Did I want all this Hebrew training? I don't really remember, but I attended the citywide Hebrew high school. It's really the only kid from my Reformed temple to do that. And I was sent off to what were then called the Hebrew speaking camps, as I mentioned. This was before people sent their children to Israel to learn Hebrew. And although I have no memory of this, I even found letters my father wrote while I was in public high school in Buffalo, trying to get me into some sort of study program in Israel in 1953-54. But he was advised, thank God, to wait for that until I was of college age, and it never happened, actually. Yes, I aimed high, aided and abetted by my parents, probably. So I went to Harvard, where I majored in history, and I see now that my long-term interests were emerging early via my choice of term paper subjects. Next slide, please. One was on the Silesian Weavers' Revolution of 1844, comparing the poem that Heinrich Heine, the German Jewish poet, wrote about it, and the play that Gerhard Hauptmann, who you see here by Struck, wrote about it later in the 19th century. I knew about Hauptmann, who's pretty much forgotten now, although he was a great German dramatist and actually was awarded the 1912 Nobel Prize in Literature. So, you know, he had his day. But I knew about him because in our attic, I had discovered this portrait of him by Struck that had never been hanging in our house. And when I asked why, it was because my father considered Hauptmann a Nazi. He probably wasn't actually a Nazi, but he had stayed in Germany during the war. Struck did the portrait in 1903, and you can't see it here, but ironically, there's a Jewish star in the left-hand corner, something Struck often did in his etchings. My other early paper in college was on Jacques-Louis David, the great French painter, and the French Revolution. Next slide, please. And how his art changed in response to the French Revolution. Of course, I knew nothing about art, just that I liked looking at it at our local museum, the Albright Art Gallery. For assistance with the subject of art and politics, I went to see the artist Ben Shahn, who was at Harvard delivering the distinguished Charles Eliot Norton lectures my sophomore year. Next slide, please. This is the book that came out of those lectures. Shahn engaged with me. He was a very lovely man. He engaged with me on the subject of art and politics, helping me with my paper on the French Revolution and art, and subsequently agreed to teach me and my roommates silk screening techniques because he thought we should be politically involved. This was like 1956, 57. And we were not politically involved in those days, but he wanted to make me feel that way. And he said the easiest way to spread political messages was through silk screening. We unfortunately used those lessons to make Valentines for our girlfriends. I don't remember making any posters in those days. But a few years later, in the mid 1960s, when I was living and working in Berkeley, I realized how prescient Sean had been, since so many of the now collectible posters for the anti-war movement and early rock concerts that came out of Berkeley were done in silkscreen. So I was apparently slowly sliding into art, happily visiting museums in the Boston area, and decidedly not taking any art history courses, in the belief that if I studied art, I might not really like looking at it. Precisely why I went to Harvard, from Harvard to Hebrew Union College, is still not entirely clear to me, other than I had been in some ways Jewishly prepared for all that by my Hebrew and Zionist upbringing. I certainly wasn't especially observant or believing, but had been very active in Reform Jewish youth movement during my high school years. And at Harvard, I was far more interested in attending concerts than Hillel, although I was very influenced by the lectures given by the late Richard Rubinstein, who was a Hillel director while I was there, and one of the first serious writers about death of God post-Holocaust discussions. But there was still a draft hovering over young men when I graduated from Harvard in 1959, so off I went to rabbinical school in Cincinnati. Although I now see that I learned a lot there and made several lifelong friends, I wasn't happy at Hebrew Union College, and when they wouldn't permit transfer to their New York school, which might have emptied out the Cincinnati campus earlier than it's now happening, I quit. The draft was always hovering, and so I needed to stay in school. Like a lot of people who grew up in Buffalo, I was always a wannabe New Yorker, and with some counseling, I was directed to graduate school in the history of art. With no undergraduate art history credits, I couldn't get into Columbia or Harvard. And so the only school that would accept me was the Institute of Fine Arts, which is part of New York University. Little did I know that it was the best school in its field. And I'm the last generation of those who studied with some of the legendary German Jewish refugee art historians, names that might not be familiar to people listening today, but are very important: Richard Eddinghausen, Richard Krautheimer, and Erwin Panofsky. But I had no money, so I needed to get part-time work. And my rabbinical school background helped me get a part-time job deciphering Hebrew inscriptions at the Jewish Museum in New York. I only gradually became aware that I was working with material that was just like what was in my father's 1929 Judaica album and the photos of my uncle's collection in San Francisco. It wasn't an intentional career direction on my part, just a job to pay my rent. But all of a sudden, gradually, pretty all of a sudden, pretty as well as gradually, I was becoming assistant curator, then curator of the collections, with limited knowledge of museum work, virtually no experience, and still part-time in graduate school. It was kind of a good example of how in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and also being in the right place at the right time, because it was also the time when the Jewish Museum had its now legendary foray into the avant-garde New York art world, led by its then director, Alan Solomon. He saw an opportunity for the museum to play a role that wasn't being played by the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim, or the Whitney in the early 1960s. And so we were showing Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, and Andy Warhol, lots of artists who were not Jewish, including showing the artists at the 1964 Venice Biennale, which Rauschenberg won the grand prize at. So my 2 feet were actually in different camps, one Judaic and the other contemporary art. With which I worked, and early Christian and Islamic art, which I was studying in graduate school, 3 feet maybe. But the pay was miserable. And although I met the woman, Leslie, who's now my wife of 58 years at the museum and at graduate school, we jumped at the opportunity for a new job that was offered to be assistant director of a new university art museum that was going to be built on the Berkeley campus. Next slide, please. Some of you may remember it. It's no longer functioning. That meant spending a few momentous years in the late 1960s in the place where things were happening. Northern California was entirely strange to me. My aunt and uncle had emigrated to San Francisco. My grandmother was living there. So I had started visiting in the 1940s. Moreover, my wife was from the Bay Area. But being in Berkeley in the 60s was an amazing experience. And my first big exhibition was a retrospective of the work of Jules Pasquin, the Bulgarian Jewish French American painter, whose work is now pretty much out of fashion. Next slide, please. I was moreover in Berkeley during the founding years of the Judah Magnus Museum, which I mentioned earlier, now part of UC Berkeley. So I was peripherally involved with the development of those collections. In 1969, I was given another great opportunity, next slide please, to spend a year in Romania and Czechoslovakia, taking care of managing an exhibition sponsored by the United States Information Agency, the first exhibition of contemporary American art to go behind the Iron Curtain. That meant Pesach in Cluj, Purim in Timișoara in Romania, as well as meeting Bucharest notorious Rabbi Moses Rosen, who was at that time helping Romanian Jews move to Israel in exchange for funds sent to Romania, and also becoming well acquainted with the extraordinary Jewish monuments in Prague. So I returned to Berkeley, and shortly after we were visited by Chaim Gamzu, Israel's foremost art critic, who had been appointed director of the Tel Aviv Museum in 1962. They were building a new museum. Gamzu was looking around at other new museum buildings. He casually asked whether I might come to Tel Aviv as his assistant and work on the new building and development. And I just remember that I said it sounded interesting. I had only been to Israel once in 1967. And hadn't really given it much thought. So this was a casual conversation. It's likely around the same time, late 1970, when our Berkeley Museum was being opened, that I was invited to interview for a position of director of the Baltimore Museum of Art. Next slide, please. That was probably the transformative moment for me in terms of realizing that I actually was in something like a museum career. This was 1971. And I benefited from my youth. They were looking for a younger person. And by then, the museum's board already included a fair number of Jews. The museum had been founded in 1914 and had been somewhat, like a lot of the museums, somewhat anti-Semitic, although one of its founders was Jacob Epstein not the sculptor, but so-called Jacob Epstein of Baltimore. And there was lingering anti-Semitism and still strong racism in Baltimore when we moved there. At age 33, I was not only the youngest, but also the first Jewish director of an American public municipal art museum. And in some ways, I was also very Jewy. I was involved with the local Jewish Federation, active in a new synagogue, and we bought a home in what had once been a restricted neighborhood, which especially amused our friends and my trustees and our neighbors because they were all invited to our annual Sukkot party in our garden, and also to the brises of both of our sons, which freaked out a lot of people who still saw it as a restricted neighborhood. Going through boxes of correspondence in the last few years, I came across letters from Chaim Gamzu of Tel Aviv, very upset with me because he thought I had committed to work for him in Tel Aviv, and all of a sudden he heard that I was director of the Baltimore Museum of Art. He was not a happy man. On the other hand, the man he did hire in my place, a Swiss Jew named Mark Scheps, eventually succeeded Gamzu as director in Tel Aviv, then went on to a very successful museum career. And I used to joke with Mark that he owed my museum career to the fact that I had turned down Gamzu. But there are other Tel Aviv ironies as well, since the Tel Aviv Museum's first director was Karl Schwartz, who had been the first director of the Berlin Jewish Museum, which opened in 1933, the very moment that Hitler came to power, and closed after Kristallnacht. Schwartz knew my father in Berlin, as I discovered letters that from Schwartz to my father. And so all of these kind of things come around and meet each other, going in different directions. My next gig after the Baltimore Museum of Art was as director of the museum program at the National Endowment for the Arts. And although I was active in Jewish cultural affairs nationally, there wasn't a lot Jewish in that job, related in that job, although I had a great time helping and getting to know museums around the country, which would have been very difficult any other way. So that was terrific. Plus, I got to stay in Baltimore while commuting to Washington, sparing our young kids at least one relocation, although they had to deal with others. From Washington, I went to serve as director of the Worcester Art Museum. Next slide, please. And in Worcester, that was really interesting. It was a lot like Buffalo, only smaller. But unlike Buffalo, it had locally owned industries. And so there was significant financial assistance still there by the foundations from the families of those industries, which really was never true in Buffalo, where Bethlehem Steel and Republic Steel, et cetera, were owned outside of the city. So Worcester was a very interesting experience. And by the time I got there, I already had Jewish trustees, one of whom was Jacob Hyatt, an industrialist who still had his Eastern European Jewish accent, but was mixing with all the waspy New Englanders, and gave funds for a major, for a new museum wing that still bears his name. Hyatt, incidentally, was the father-in-law of the New England Patriots owner, Robert Kraft, of whom you've probably heard. But Worcester was also different from Buffalo in that because of the age of the foundations and the welfare, it had a really important collection of old master paintings. And the Jewish community, we felt, was less welcoming than the one in Baltimore, much more insular. Nevertheless, for our son's bar mitzvah, our older son's bar mitzvah, we managed to get a number of Worcester's oldest families, members of the oldest families, for what was probably their first time in a shul. In 1986, I was invited by the new secretary of the Smithsonian, Bob Adams, to interview for a job there. I said, never mind, I already did my bid in Washington. And he said, wait a minute, this may be the most interesting museum job in the world. So I said, I apologized and went for an interview and got the job as assistant secretary for museums, which was a completely new job. No one person had ever been responsible for overseeing all of the many Smithsonian museums. As a student of American Jewish history, I was also very aware, maybe no one else was, that in a strange way I was following in the footsteps of the great Cyrus Adler. Well, next slide, please. Not exactly his footsteps. For one thing, Adler was a major scholar, something that no one would ever call me. He had been he was a Semitic scholar, was founder of the Jewish Welfare Board, president of Philadelphia's Dropsy College, chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. But he was also Smithsonian's librarian and curator of world religions. Next slide, please. And acquired the so-called Jefferson Bible for the Smithsonian. And in 1901, published the first catalog of ceremonial objects deposited in the U.S. National Museum. Even in my earlier Jewish museum days, I had known and admired his publication because it was so important for the history of Judaica in America. So the idea of somehow feeling like maybe I had some relationship to Cyrus Adler always made me feel good. But the job involved a lot of interaction with museums across the world. And that also meant that I could be involved. We also published I didn't do it, but Grace Cohen Grossman, with the support that I helped, financial support that my office helped supply, published a new, next slide, please, a new version of the Judaica at the Smithsonian, which is very important because it went across all the areas of the Smithsonian. There's Jewish material in all sorts of places that you wouldn't believe. I was allowed to work with museums across the world, and one of those was the Israel Museum, and I was invited to be an international advisor, a role that it had had since its founding in the 1960s. And I followed some very distinguished people, such as the former director of the Stedelijk Museum, Willem Sandberg, and the former director of the Guggenheim Museum, James Johnson Sweeney. I was the final person to have that job because after me, it really didn't seem necessary for the Israel Museum to prove itself as part of the international community, which it certainly was already by the time I got there. It is, but it provided me an opportunity to spend a lot of time in Israel. My Smithsonian life also mostly, I wasn't running museums, I was dealing with crises, and a lot of them involved issues like Native American political stuff. So for example, when there were arguments about Native Americans wanting human remains back, and the anthropologists fighting that, I used to try to argue on behalf of the Native Americans, because I remembered that Jewish law has very strong feelings about what you do with Jewish remains. Or for example, at a discussion at South Dakota's Pine Ridge Reservation, I remember there was conversation about how much Indian blood somebody had. And I raised my hand saying, hey guys, I'm uncomfortable with this discussion because I was born in Nazi Germany and Jewish blood was a major issue for the Nazis. I don't know that this changed the discourse, but I think the Indians were kind of shocked by my dealing with this. And I was very proud to bring the exhibition of degenerate art that Stephanie Barron had curated at the Los Angeles County Museum in 1991, to bring it to Washington, because that was something I did because none of my museum colleagues, the people that I supervised, were interested in it. And so I just found a space at the Smithsonian and brought that exhibition to Washington. And it really had a huge impact in Washington. I think that was the reason it eventually went to Germany as well. That was the art that the Nazis had, the contemporary modern art that the Nazis had declared degenerate. I went from there to YIVO, the great Yiddish archive and library in New York, which is now in the Center for Jewish History, although it wasn't there when I was not yet there when I worked there. And I had been traveling during that time, especially ever since my first trip to Berlin in 1963. I'd gone to Berlin often. And so I knew a lot of people there, and one thing led to another. And I was invited by the new director of the Jewish Museum, Michael Blumenthal, the former Secretary of the Treasury in the Carter administration, to be his deputy director and chief administrative officer while we were getting the museum ready to open. And that seemed like a great opportunity for me. The famous Daniel Libeskind building was just being completed. We were working on staffing the museum and working on its first exhibitions. So that was what I did until I left about 9 months before the museum actually opened, when I went to London to direct the Gilbert collection, again, a Jewish collection, but collection relation, because it was formed by a Jewish expat Brit, Arthur Gilbert, who was living in Los Angeles and who had formed a collection of decorative arts really for the Los Angeles Museum of Art, but was then lured to have it displayed in London at Somerset House. Next, please. Next slide, please. And so the collection, next slide, please. So the collection went to London, and can we get the next slide? And it didn't last very long. It was only, sorry, stay with that, please, Richard. It would only stay in London for about 3 or 4 years as a separate museum. Then it went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where it now sits. I retired after that, moved to Washington and then to New York. And I really think I want to end by, I hope there'll be time for questions, but I want to end by something that kind of turns all this around in a very different way, and namely to give you a sense of there's all the art that I worked with and all the jobs I had and all of that, and then there's the art that I really care about. In a fundraising brochure, which we did in Baltimore many years ago, I remember saying something like, looking at art is like being in love, and that it was a special relationship, and that I really didn't know how to express it in words because it was that kind of a relationship. So I thought I'd show you some of the things that are part of that special relationship to me. Here's a work that I grew up with in Buffalo, the late Hogarth's The Lady Last Steak. And I remember my father explaining to me the desperation of this lady losing her, losing at cards and having to do God knows what with the fellow at whom she lost the card game to. Next, please. A work called The Unrepentant Thief, which is just a beautiful figure from probably from a crucifixion scene that I also just loved when I was growing up. And then maybe my favorite piece in Buffalo, next slide, please. The incredible Yellow Christ of Paul Gauguin, which he did when he was in Brittany in his Pont-Aven days, and which is actually an image that is still in the church. The actual Yellow Christ, the Christ is actually in the church, which I visited. Those are the things that move me, and maybe you can see where this is going. I've long found myself deeply moved by certain works of art and not by others. So for example, next slide, please. When I was at the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam last week, I was really struck. I was really struck by this painting by Jan Voorman and how it didn't do anything to me. And I realized it's interesting as a depiction and it's informative, but my interests in art are for things that are transformative. Something that gives me a sense of awe and keeps calling me back. And here's some examples, sort of random, but starting with works in the Louvre. Next, please. My three favorite pieces in the Louvre are the Avignon Pietà, which I religiously both ways always go to see. Next, please. Mantegna's Calvary scene, which I've loved ever since I was in graduate school and thought it was very large, and remember coming to the Louvre and being shocked to find out that it wasn't very large. And Raphael's portrait of Castiglione. Next slide, please. Which just is beyond beautiful. And I'm always standing there watching people walk by while they're on their way to the Mona Lisa, wanting to say, please stop here, you got to see this. In Philadelphia, next slide, please. I love Roger van der Weyden's crucifixion diptych. One of the glories of Northern Renaissance art in the United States. It's just mind-blowing. And in Venice, have to admit, next slide, please. I can't get enough of Tintoretto's enormous crucifixion scene in the Scuola di San Rocco, which I've spent hours looking at. I simply never tire of it. I mean, I find myself in it, and it's a religious experience in the sense of being spiritual, but not in the sense of being Christian to me in any way, even though clearly it's a Christological painting. And the painting in front of which I've probably spent more time than any other, next slide, please, is Fra Angelico's nativity scene in the National Gallery in Washington. Well, Fra Angelico and Fra Lippo Lippi. And that's because I used to go at noon when I worked at the Smithsonian. I just would walk over to the National Gallery and sit there and meditate in front of that painting and always see new things, new people, new ideas. And the fact that that it's a Christian painting somehow, I know intellectually, but it has nothing to do with my meditation in a funny way. Well, you get the idea. I could go on much longer with other examples. I still believe in the transformational potential of art. And for whatever reason, my Western educated tastes have drawn me to works that are often Christian and also often devotional, I have to admit, because for me, the eloquence of their mystery never really feels sectarian. I still feel I do this very much as a Jew. And with that, I will end and be happy to take comments or questions from folks.
Tom, thank you very, very much for this extraordinarily rich presentation. I've never, in the 26 years I've been doing this, ever been privileged to hear such a powerful autobiography that was linked to so many things, and through which the biography of your family and your autobiography courses through many of the most important changes of Jewish life in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So thank you very much for this extraordinary presentation. Now, if there are people who have questions, please use the question and answer function. And we have one already. Let me read it to you. This is a wonderful question from Corey Weiss, who writes, "What exhibition that you were involved with are you most proud of?"
Oh, that's easy. That's really easy. That's the Degenerate Art Exhibition that I mentioned briefly. It started on the West Coast. I know this is a West Coast sponsored event. It started on the West Coast, and Stephanie Barron, who is curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and a specialist in 20th century German art, she came up with the idea and did this extraordinary show. I saw it when I was visiting LA, and I said, oh, this has to come to Washington. And it wasn't scheduled to come to Washington. And we went to a lot of hoops because you had to get extensions for loans, et cetera, to bring it to Washington. But yeah, it still resonates with me. I didn't do the exhibition, but it still resonates with me. My involvement with that is something I'm very proud of. And to this day, it's still in the middle of my head because it had so many connections to things about which my whole life is connected in a funny way.
I know that several people have raised their hands. So could I ask that you type your questions, please? Or Corey Weiss has a follow-up, I think. He writes, "Amazing presentation of the UCSB art history class of 1992. That's Noah's father. Are there any current artists you are fond of? My parents took me to Degenerate Art Show in LA. It had a profound impact on me."
Well, I don't spend a lot of time looking. I don't follow contemporary art pretty much. I kind of feel that where I am in life, I'm really interested in enjoying what I know. And I don't go to galleries and all these art fairs, et cetera, et cetera. I did actually just see two wonderful exhibitions in New York. One of them is at the Met, a contemporary painter named Cecily Brown. She's a British woman. I think she's Black. And I thought they were just extraordinarily vivid, really engaging paintings. And another is at the Whitney Museum by a woman named Joan Quick-to-See Smith, who's a Native American painter whom I knew about because of all the involvements I had with Native Americans when I worked at the Smithsonian. And again, very moving, just extraordinarily interesting work. But there's no, one artist that I favor over another. I mean, that's why I kind of ended with some of my best in show things.
Could I ask a question? And again, I'm asking people who have raised their hands to type a question into us. But while they're doing that, I hope, could I ask a question about what were the most difficult issues you confronted with the Berlin Jewish Museum?
Well, okay, there's several. One is that I assume that some of the people that are on this Zoom have visited Berlin. And so one of them is that the Libeskind building, which wasn't really built to be a Jewish museum, but that's a whole other story I won't go into now. It's not a very functional building as a museum, and they've had to overcome that. The latest exhibition is actually quite good, but museum has a different need from architectural ego, and so that was one thing. But in another way, there's the discussions that I felt most strongly about were questions that are still not resolved in my mind about how you tell the history of the Jews when you're in Berlin. And the Jewish Museum in its initial exhibition, and even in the one that's up now, which is about a year old, has decided to deal with the concept of German Jews. Whereas I believe that that's a very wishy-washy concept, and they leave out entirely the importance of Germany, especially Berlin, but not only Berlin, to lots and lots of Eastern European Jews, for whom Germany was really a critical stop on the way to somewhere, whether it's Berdichevsky or Chaim Nachman Bialik, Isaac Bashevis Singer, or Chagall, whom I mentioned earlier. And so none of this is evident in the museum. And I just always had a real problem with that, and I still do. But, it's not my call.
Okay, are there other questions? Well, perhaps we've come to the end of our time with you, Tom, today. This has been an exceedingly rich and wonderful program, in which I think all of us have learned a great deal through the life of your family and through your life. And so I thank you very, very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for letting me be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.